Good evening, good evening. Welcome back. Here we are in a different location this evening from usual, but there's some renovations going on in my house, and I've had to move rooms and locales so that we could continue on with Summa Elvetica, a casuistry of the Elvish controversy. I hope you're all well. Very excited. I got some stuff in the mail today. I've managed to replace a lost copy of my Reclaiming the Catholic Church. I lent that to somebody, never got it back. The True History of Vatican II and the Visible Remnant of the Real Catholic Church, now that the Vatican is a pederast-infested hive of imposters. Yes, that's quite a nice little title. Considering I've been to Rome and to seminary, I can attest that there is some truth to that title. But that is by Giuseppe Falato, otherwise known as the Kurgan, and I look forward to quickly going over that. And then I'd like to do an in-depth, deep dive review of that book, because I'd like Giuseppe's thesis to be put out there. He is a sedevacantist. I don't know if I can be a sedevacantist, although I'm not really anything at the moment. But I'm a sort of I call what I am. I call it Calibanity. I really wanted to call this channel Mere Calibanity, but I'm always going through different iterations of the name. So long as it's not monetized, I can change names as I fancy. But Mere Calibanity, it even takes out the Bermuda element. It really is just so obscure. Why would anybody know what it is? I mean, Caliban is connected to the Tempest, and Bermuda takes place in the. Did I just say Bermuda takes place in the Tempest? The Tempest takes place in Bermuda. Those still vexed Bermudes, as it is written. But anyway, enough of all of that. Let's get on with it, man. It's the evening. It's been a good day. Oh, you know what I tried for the first time? I tried a creatine pre-workout today. It's just something that's in one of the health stores in Bermuda, artificial sweetener, just one scoop. But I used to take creatine when I was young and fit and gorgeous. No, I never was. But I was fit at one time. I stopped creatine years ago, and then I read that actually as you get older, creatine has more benefits than when you're younger, really. And so I took it for the first time today, and maybe it was psychosomatic, but I did a personal best on deadlift and a personal best on squats, and that's compound, exercises, barbells, not machines. So I was pretty happy. I'm still literally hundreds of pounds away from what I used to do, but I'm getting there. Like there was a real increase. I felt like, wow, that was some progress. It was not. I never felt like I was getting a jolt or like a burst of energy or anything. I just was like, that feels good. Oh, I think I can put another plate on. That seems all right. Let's do another one. So yeah, it was just. I don't know. It was a good day at the gym. You feel so good afterwards too. That natural high is incredible. So yeah, we are going to get now down to the next one. Step 3. Oh, Vox, why are they steps and not chapters? Again, there's a big quote in Latin, which I'm not, if I keep trying to read this in Latin, I'm going to end up getting a cease and desist letter from the dread ilk. It took nearly an hour for Hezekias, the Mycenaean commander, to extricate the party from the horde of well-wishing senators, cavaliers, priests, and archbishops. In the end, he'd managed it with the help of Cassius Claudo's famously sharp-edged tongue. Marcus was relieved to see both Marsupor and Lodi waiting for him with the baggage train. It was bad enough to worry about holy wars and murderous merchants without having to contemplate months on the road without a friend or even a single change of clothing. Somehow, he wasn't surprised to see that Marsupor had talked the stable master into providing him with a rather better mount than human slaves were generally permitted. Lodi wasn't actually tied to the mule, upon which he sat like a bag of potatoes, but Marcus thought it wiser to leave dwarven pride unchallenged, rather than bring up his wounded state again. The heavy chainmail worn by the dwarf would probably suffice to alert the entire party should he fall, at which point the matter could be addressed. As he had promised, Lodi bore his suffering in stoic silence, only emitting the occasional grunt of pain when the mule to which he was securely fastened made a false step on the cart-rutted road. As poorly stitched as the wound was, it had not broken open, and, thanks to the healing ministrations of one of the Michelines, a healer of some skill, the dwarf looked to make a full recovery. Fortunately, this first day's ride was expected to be an easy one. Marcus was fascinated by Lodi. The dwarf was a short but powerful creature, so similar to a man. For all his reading, Marcus knew very little of Lodi's race, which had not endowed Selenoth with a written history or even a literature worthy of note. There was, of course, the song of the great siege of Iron Mountain, an epic saga that had taken all Amor by storm 5 or 6 years ago, and had inspired the battle recreation in which Lodi had been injured. But even that had been penned by a Savander, and though it was supposed to be derived from the dwarven oral tradition, the scholarly consensus was that it was of questionable verisimilitude. The embassy traveling party was rather larger than Marcus had imagined it would be. The acerbic bishop was attended by no fewer than 2 priests, 6 slaves, and 6 guards, wearing the green and black livery of his diocese. Appropriately more humble, the Jamite priest, Father Estes, was accompanied by only 2 slaves, one rotund and jolly like him, the other tall, gaunt, and taciturn. The 19 Michelines, led by Sir Hezekias, were unattended by slaves or squires. It seemed the warrior priests were accustomed to serving themselves, which was, Marcus thought, admirable and in keeping with the custom of the less militant orders. Indeed, no sooner had they reached the baggage train at the northern gate of the city than they doffed their gorgeous panoply in favor of stained and weathered riding gear. Only the rich blue leather of their scabbards and the bright bronze hilts of their swords gave the casual observer any indication of their unique vocation. Marcus had little fear that those swords would need to be drawn any time before reaching Elebrion. The soldier priests weren't redeemers, but the Michelines' uniformly close-cropped hair and military bearing would give sufficient pause to any bandit gangs tempted by the party's excellent horses and well-loaded wagons. 2 outriding Michelin priests scouted the road ahead, so far in advance that they could barely be seen, while 2 more brought up the distant rear lest they be overtaken unaware. Both Marcus and Marsupor wore their swords as well. Marcus's was a fine blade, though never tested in battle, and Marsupor's was a gaudily decorated thing more suitable for the theatre than the battlefield. Lodi wore 2 thick butcher's axes from his belt. No battle axe, as the training master had indicated, and there was a very large crossbow strapped to the back of his mule as well. It looked like a siege bow, a weapon designed to be mounted on a wall. Marcus wondered if this had been pulled from secret armory of his uncle's, or if he had ordered it for Lodi especially for this embassy. No human could use the cumbersome thing afoot, but glancing at Lodi's scarred tree-like arms, Marcus decided that the dwarf might very well be able to. Marcus rode near the end of the column. Only the 3 supply wagons and the rearmost pair of Michelines were behind him. A 4th wagon, in which the Archbishop, Father Estes, and the 2 other churchmen rode, was positioned ahead of them in the middle of the line. Marcus had been worried about Lodi's mule being too slow, but fortunately all 4 wagons were drawn by teams of 4 mules that kept their pace to a relative crawl. They rode for 2 hours through flat coastal plain on a road flanked by hills that gradually rose toward the horizon on either side. The land had been burned dry by the merciless summer sun. The hilltops were brown and treeless, and what vegetation managed to survive was mostly scrub brush. Every now and then in the distance they would see a gnarled tree standing alone, stubbornly digging its exposed roots into the soil, like an old leather-skinned farmer refusing to abandon a family farm long gone fallow. That pitiless sun was now rising toward its peak, and it was apparent to Marcus that he was not the only one getting bored with their slow progress over the roads. Even the dwellings they passed seemed lifeless. Tall, narrow, stuccoed stone structures painted in various shades of yellow that had long ago faded into a cheerless goldenrod. He was eager to speak again with Father Estes. Perhaps the friendly priest could help him know how he was supposed to behave as the Sanctif's personal proxy. But Estes was riding with the bishop, Cassius Claudo, near the front of the column, and Marcus wouldn't dream of approaching the bishop without an invitation. It occurred to him then that the Sanctif hadn't offered him any servants for the trip, or even a letter of introduction that identified Marcus as his representative. When he'd been summoned to the palace, he thought his position had risen high indeed. But now, riding behind a long line of horses' rumps, he felt again like no more than a young priest yet to prove his value. How to do so? That was the challenge he faced, and with some dismay he began to realize how large the gap between potential and accomplishment appeared to be once one seriously contemplated that gap with an eye toward leaping it. Even as a boy, Marcus had dreamed of writing a text that would astonish the world with its brilliance. Heroes of the Colosseum were lauded one year and disregarded the next. Few could remember who had been seated on the consular thrones more than 2 or 3 years ago. Even generals accorded the signal honor of a triumph are usually forgotten within a decade. Only the scholars, great scholars such as Augustinus, Oxonus, Deputapulus, and the castrate, were granted the immortal gift of burning their memory into the minds of men. A text, it must be, but where to begin? One day Cassius Claudo had stared at a blank parchment and then written that first word from which had sprung the magnificent Summa Spiritus. Presumably Estes had also done the same with his Ordo Selenus Sapiens. It was like planting a seed, only he did not know from whence the seed would come. Did one simply wait for inspiration to strike? That seemed insensible. After all, a man might wait all his life for inspiration to arrive of its own accord. And why should he wait? There were few men who knew the elves well, and not since his grandfather's grandfather's day had man been permitted to enter the high city. Claudo's masterpiece was based entirely on human sources. If, on this journey, Marcus might somehow be granted access to the works of great elven philosophers, whose very existence was yet unknown to the scholars of the empire, he might well hope to write something of interest, if not of note. The elves must be his subject then, and the elves alone. He would focus solely on them, a subject deemed well worthy of contemplation by the mere fact of the Sanctif's particular interest, in the place of the wider scope of the Summa Spiritus. It would be a second Summa, an Elvic Summa, a Summa Elvetica. The castrate's method would not suffice. Marcus had no authority. His words bore no intellectual weight. He could not just proclaim a thing and expect men to hold it to be true. Perhaps his Summa could be in the form of a dialogue. No, too pretentious by far. Only an arrogant and supercilious soul like Deputapulus, with his bent for mendacious manipulation, would think that his carefully orchestrated playing of the two sides toward an inevitable, if not necessarily logical, end was a conclusive form of argument. Yes. Vox has made clear his disdain for Plato's Republic and probably David Bentley Hart's latest, All Full of Gods. Marcus could rely upon neither reputation nor authority. Therefore, he required a more systematic and methodical approach to the matter. Yes, that was the way. A systematic consideration of the issue would force him to begin at the most natural place to begin, namely, the beginning. Does an elf have a soul? No, that was taking it too far at the start. In the beginning was God, who made man in his image. God also made the animals, albeit not in his image. God also made the elves. But were they then more properly akin to man or to animals? He already inclined toward the former, but upon reflection there were significant points to be made on either side. What really was needed was "You have an interesting servant there." Marcus jumped in his saddle, coming only reluctantly out of his contemplations. He turned to see who had spoken to him. It was one of the younger Micheline priests. He rode up alongside Marcus and indicated the dwarf. Oh, yes. Marcus searched his memory for the Micheline's name. He'd been introduced to all of them, but it was hard to remember which of the 20 names belonged to this particular priest. Neaman? No. Zephinus? That was it. He blinked, realizing that the priest was still talking. You don't think the elves will object? About what? Why, about your dwarf, of course. Zephynis flushed at the sorcerer elf, seemingly far enough ahead of him in the train to be out of earshot. Zephynis flushed as the sorcerer elf, seemingly far enough ahead of them in the train to be out of earshot, suddenly turned around and glanced at him. Then the sorcerer shrugged and turned back to his conversation with his elven companion. Apparently not, Marcus said, stifling a smile. Marsipur was riding ahead, engaged in an animated conversation with three of the Michelines and gesturing in a lordly manner. Well, what do you know, Zephynis said. Those long ears really do serve a purpose after all. All things serve a purpose, brother, Marcus said. Our inability to discern that purpose does not indicate its purpose, does not indicate its absence, only our shortcomings. Zephynis eyed him speculatively. Ah, a philosopher. So I assume you're the Valyrian who does not prefer war. Do forgive me, I thought it was the other lad up there. You're not the first to make that mistake. My man Marsipur hasn't quite mastered the art of servility. I suspect your dwarf hasn't either, the priest commented dryly, glancing at the taciturn Lodi, who had yet to utter more than a grunt to Marcus or anyone else throughout the morning. I should have known you'd be less grandiose. Your father isn't one to throw his weight around either. It's probably just as well. I imagine one Magnus in the family is enough. You know my father? Yes, Zephynis said. I served under General Valerius last fall in the Garmagal River campaign. He brought 2 of his legions across the river, 7th and 9th, I believe, and the abbot general sent him 3 squads of Michelines as reinforcements. I remember he wasn't very pleased to see us when we arrived. He'd asked for 4. But happily, as it turned out, we didn't have to do much more than suppress their shamans and so forth. Their infantry didn't show much stomach for a fight once we crossed and smashed their center. I doubt we lost more than 50 or 60 men, all told. Marcus nodded, remembering his father's letter that had, he'd said, been dictated as the First Legion crossed the river, supposedly while under fire from goblin archers and artillery. For all that he was an undemonstrative man, his father did seem to have somewhat of a flair for the dramatic when it came to writing letters. Nearly half of the letters Marcus had received from Lucius Valerius were allegedly written during the course of battle. Marcus wasn't sure if it was because the proximity of danger caused his father to think of his family, or if he merely sought an easily impressed audience to appreciate his casual heroics. They had an illusionist, did they not? Zephynis laughed. They did indeed. The wretched little beast conjured up a vision of a terrible flash flood just as the 1st century reached the far bank, scared half the 7th to death. We probably lost as many fools to drowning as fell to any of their quarrels that day. It could have been real trouble. Had they counterattacked at that moment, it would have hit us hard, but fortunately, by the grace of God, they held their ground. Marcus frowned. He didn't like to hear that his father had apparently come so near to failure, especially in such a minor action. The victory at Garmagal had barely registered in Amor. Had his father's legions not been involved, he probably wouldn't have known about it himself. His displeasure must have been evident, because Zephynis stopped laughing and raised a finger. No, lad, it was hardly the general's fault. He'd warned us to watch for mischief with the waters, that we were looking for elementals and the like. We weren't expecting goblins to have an illusionist. There's not so many voders among the gobos, you see, it being mostly mortal men who go in for the more abstract sorceries. He glanced forward at their alien companion, shaking his head. Or elves. Especially elves. I don't know that I understand the distinction, Marcus said. My tutor, Father Aurelius, isn't enthusiastic about us learning about magic of any kind, not even the battle magics. I've picked a few things up from my father's tales, or from a few historical accounts of the classic engagements, but I'm not even sure what the difference between an illusionist and a shaman is. No, I can't imagine your tutor would be, Zephynis said with a smile. Not if he's ordained. He's right about that with regard to most students. Your average priestling has no need of such information. It would serve no purpose to dangle the evils of a fallen world in front of young minds being honed for the higher purpose. But you, on the other hand, on this journey are going to be surrounded by enchanters, illusionists, sorcerers, and even archmages in a matter of weeks. So before you offend the wrong elf, it might behoove you to have some idea of which ones are capable of turning you into a turnip and which ones aren't. Don't concern yourself on my account, Marcus grinned and pointed at Marsupur. Now he, on the other hand, could likely use your instruction. Without it, we can safely assume he will be in turnip form before nightfall on the day of our arrival. Is it possible he might be more useful as a turnip? I'd say probable, Marcus responded. They both laughed, and for the first time since he had mounted his horse that morning, Marcus began to feel that perhaps the embassy might not end in death and debacle. He found himself rather liking the young Michaelin, whose mien was not at all as holy or as grim as he'd expected of a warrior priest sworn to celibacy and slaughter. What did you think of my father? The general, Zephinus said. Well, I can't say that I saw very much of him. This may surprise you, but generals seldom make a habit of consulting with their fidelists. Fidelists. Sorry. Oh, yeah, fidelity. Oh, Vox, you and your vocab. They tell the Micheline captain where the enemy magic is and what we're to do, then the captain tells us. Still, it wasn't hard to see that your father had a lot of experience and that he was a good commander of men. He's intelligent, he's straightforward, he knows how to use what he's got, and he knows how to fight. The legions seek that in a general above all else. Now, perhaps he's more respected by his men than he is loved, but I imagine he prefers it that way. Yes, I imagine he does, murmured Marcus. The comment drew a raised eyebrow from Zephinus, but the young priest continued as if he hadn't been interrupted. General Valerius doesn't give a lot of speeches or try to inspire the troops with words like some generals do. My first campaign, we were serving under Nonius Messius. Now there was a man who was well enamored with the sound of his own voice. He didn't talk, he orated. He even had a scribe following him around, writing down all of his interminable speeches for posterity. Were they any good? Certainly, if you wanted your soldiers well rested. I can't say they weren't effective either. Listening to Messius was how I learned to sleep on my feet. If you can find a scroll of his speeches when we return to the city, I do recommend you buy one. You'll find them more effective than warm milk and honey on a sleepless night. After Messius, your father's notion of an inspiring pre-battle talk came as a real surprise. And what was that? His style of speech, that is. Succinct and pertinent. At Garmagal, he rose in front of the centuries in the vanguard, drew his sword, and pointed at the far bank of the river. You can see that they're over there, he said. Go kill them. There were no cheers. The drummers didn't even start, and no one realized he was done. But as it turned out, that was all he needed to say. We certainly killed enough of them that day. Marcus smiled, thinking about his father's characteristic laconism. Marcus had argued with him before his father had left to take command of the legions 2 years ago. General Valerius had intended to bring him along as a staff aide in order to season him and expose him to battle for the first time, but Marcus had been fixated upon the idea of a career as a church scholar. Fortunately for him, his mother, Father Aurelius, and Magnus himself were all of the opinion that Valerius had shed enough blood for a more, and that Marcus was destined for something other than battlefields and bloodshed. At the time, Marcus had felt almost disdainful of his father's brutal profession, but now, having come to understand both the need for such men and the high regard in which they were held by others he respected, he was beginning to wonder if perhaps he had missed a unique opportunity. How does one, he hesitated, unsure of how to phrase his request, how do you balance the demands of your ordinate with the requirements of your profession? Zephinus smiled at him and shook his head as he answered the thought that lurked behind the question rather than the question itself. There was a flicker of what might have been pity in his eyes. No, Marcus Valerius, our brotherhood is not for you. Should St. Michael ever call you to his banner, you will know that call for what it is, and you will have no such questions. I don't understand. Of course you don't. Have you ever seen purple whorls of sorcery spinning in the air as an archmage gathers his evil magic together? Have you seen the sky darken under a cloud of imps, sprites, and demons as an army of Ehomum shake their spears and chant their guttural, thick-tongued summonings? Can you see the aura of green, black, and gold that surrounds yonder elf? Zephinus pointed to the shorter elf, the one wearing the sorcerer's robes. No, I've never seen anything like that. Can you really see such things? I see them, whether I will or no. I can no more not see them than I can avoid seeing you. Zephinus grinned as Marcus glanced back and forth between him and the elf, obviously trying to see what was not apparent to his eyes. I don't jest, young Valerius. The fifth eye is how the saint calls us to his service. The fifth eye? That sounds esoteric. It's nothing of the sort. It's merely a turn of phrase in honor of Saint Oculatus, whose birth name was Quintus Tullius. He was the first to be given the gift of the Holy Vision. His men were being slaughtered by elven archers hidden behind an invisibility spell, and when he cried out to God, his prayer was answered, and he was given the eyes to see behind the accursed veil. Haven't you heard stories of some lad or other accused of witchcraft because he saw what his elders could not? Fortunately, the Brotherhood keeps watch for such promising young men, and they usually manage to intervene before any harm is done. Usually? To be honest, I've never heard of anyone blessed with the fifth eye being burned. St. Michael does protect his own, but then one can't be sure of what one doesn't know. No, that's true. Is it only boys, then, who are called by the saint? To date, it's only been men and boys. I don't know what we would do should a lass be given the gift, or what purpose that would serve. A woman can't ride to war, after all. Well done, Vox. Based. Elves says fight. A gruff voice redolent with gravel spoke behind him. Both Marcus and Zephinus craned their necks to stare at the dwarf, who stared back at them expressionless from the swaying back of his fat mule. Yes, they do, don't they, Sir Dwarf? I beg your pardon, I fear I have forgotten your name. Lodi shrugged. Dwarf will serve. We're not likely to encounter many of my kin on the way to the Elflands. His name is Lodi, Marcus said. He's supposed to be the less useless half of my bodyguard, but he's still recovering from a wound he received at the Colosseum. Ah, a gladiator then. Lodi shook his head. Not by choice, Marcus added, nor of my doing. I bought him from the Reds. Did you now? I am curious. How does a dwarf of sufficient martial talents to survive the arena find himself battling criminals and animals for the pleasure of the good people of Amor in the first place? Never you mind that priestling, Lodi muttered. Sounds as if you fought them too, though. The elves? Zephinus said. No, I am too young to have had the honor, and may God and St. Michael grant that does not change throughout the course of this trip. Seeing as we have no eagles to spare, I prefer the High King didn't take my head as a trophy. What would the elf want with eagles? Lodi asked. They're a mite small for his sky riders. Marcus laughed. Not the birds, the legendary standards, Lodi. The elf king still has the two his father took at the battle of Aldous Thald. They're the only ones Amor has ever lost that we didn't manage to take back. My uncle wanted the Sanctive to trade them in return for the church, recognizing that they are ensouled. Zephinus gave him a skeptical look. And your uncle is? Lucius Valerius, called Magnus. I should have known. Well, that's not a bad idea, actually. Marcus suppressed his first indignant protest and contented himself with a mild observation. It would appear Mycalenes don't go in for a lot of theology. Or philosophy? I wouldn't say that, Zephinus protested with a grin. Why, sometimes our debates over who to kill first can last for hours. Marcus smiled. Still, I wonder if anyone here actually know how to fight them. Elves, I mean, not that we want to, but it seems to me that perhaps it might be useful to know something more than the year in which Cedranus fell to the orcs. Marcus glanced at Lodi, but the dwarf was staring off into the horizon with an expression that seemed to indicate he was done speaking for the nonce. Zephinus, on the other hand, was rather more loquacious. Happily we have with us someone who is said to have battled them on at least one occasion. Do excuse me, but for a moment, noble sir and dwarf, and I shall return. The young warrior priest urged his horse into a brief trot until he reached the side of two of his fellow Mycalenes, who were riding in companionable silence farther up the narrow column. Their party stretched out along the road as the sun rose toward its apex. Zephinus returned, bearing in his wake an older Mycalene with a close-trimmed beard that was shot with grey. His receding hairline was lined with a white scar that nearly spanned his forehead, as if he'd been wearing a helmet so long that it had left a permanent mark upon him. Or, as was much more likely the case, some long ago enemy had nearly removed the top of his head with a sword or axe on a battlefield that was now otherwise forgotten. His horse was a magnificent chestnut, very nearly the equal of Barat, Marcus's own mount. Marcus Valerius, Zephinus said, I present the blessed Sir Claudius Serenus. Serenus nodded, and Marcus returned the greeting, a bit more deeply. It wasn't hard to remember to be properly respectful to a veteran soldier who looked as if he'd had breakfasted on raw orc legs earlier that morning. An honor, blessed sir. The scarred Mickeling flashed his teeth momentarily. Call me Serenus. That or Brother Serenus will do. Heard you a courteous young pup. Perhaps you won't forget to curtsy to King Carwin or such and get us all killed, eh? I shouldn't like to displease the sanctive Brother Serenus. Yes, I'm sure it's fear of his displeasure that would make your bowels clench and the acid burn in the back of your throat when we reach the heights. Or when you stand in the place where the mountain meets the sky, darkness falls, and you hear the cries of the high king's warhawk soaring unseen somewhere high above you. Are you so certain that I shall need to wait until then? I don't think it's the lack of breakfast that seems to have soured my stomach. Serenus smiled, a more genuine smile this time. Takes a brave lad to admit that he's afraid. I think he'll do well, Valerius, should it come to swords and elvish sorcery. Won't make a difference, mind you, but at least you won't shame your name, probably. I'm confident I shall sleep better for the knowledge. Brother, Marcus here was eager to know more about how the... Brother, Marcus here was eager to know more about how the elves make war, as Ephinus said. And since I'm told you have some experience with that, I thought perhaps you might further his education. Claudius Serenus waved his arm, his gesture taking in the road disappearing into the horizon before him. I don't seem to have anything better to do, he said. This is a dry and dusty business. Give me a skin to wet my whistle, and we shall see if the stories of an old war dog can while away an hour or three. Marcus dutifully produced a wineskin, which the old warrior priest took. He opened it and expertly sprayed a stream of Valerian Primus into his mouth without wasting a single drop or further soiling the sweat-stained tunic that he wore open down to his chest. His graying brows rose with surprise. That's a good vintage you've got there, lad. Yours, I'm thinking. It's of the house, yes, Marcus nodded in respectful acknowledgement. Please keep it, blessed sir, as a small measure of the regard House Valerius bears for the noble order of St. Michael. The order, the man said. Ephinus pointed out as he leaned over his horse's neck with a hand extended. That means me too. Let me try it. I couldn't allow that, little brother. Not in good conscience. It's far too early in the day to risk sun and grey paddling such a young pate as yours. He saluted Marcus with the skin, gave it one more healthy squeeze, then twisted the carved spout closed and slung it off the horn of his saddle. Now, as to your question, can either of you tell me the defining characteristic of an elven army? Archery, Ephinus said. He didn't seem inclined to complain about being denied a taste of House Valerius' best. Their archers have far greater range with their longbows than we can match with our slings and spears, which makes it hard to come to grips with them. That's true, to be sure, but it's something more basic than that. Marcus racked his brain trying to think of every military history he'd read that mentioned the elves. The Tactica of Laius contains several accounts of famous battles with them, including Ardiswald, Bremulon, and Tarforus, but elven involvement aside, there wasn't a single similarity between the three battles that he could think of: an ambush, a battlefield, and a city defense. As Ephinus had said, it was the superiority of their deadly longbows that sprang first to Marcus's mind. The historical accounts were no doubt exaggerated, but there had to be an element of metaphorical truth, at least, in the descriptions of how their arrows could darken the day. If it wasn't the archers, what could it be? Their dark magic was superlative, but even the men of Savondarum used magecraft in battle, the peril to their souls notwithstanding. Would an experienced veteran like Serenus find it worthy of such particular note? Then another thought occurred to him as he happened to glance in the dwarf's direction. It struck him that the two old warriors might be evenly matched for who bore more scars. Is it that they have no infantry? He suggested. Of course they have infantry, Ephinus said dismissively. Most of their archers are on foot, and even their light cavalry usually dismount when they fight at range. No, I mean they don't have any heavy infantry. We do, the Savonders do, the dwarves do, the orcs do, even the goblins do. You think of how the orcs use them as auxiliaries on the wings when they're not mounted. The Troll King doesn't have anything but heavy infantry, but the only elves that wear proper armor are their lancers, and they're mounted. Aye, General Valerius, Serenus barked in response. The grizzled warrior thumped his chest in what was obviously a sardonic salute, but his eyes were sparkling with good humor. The young scholar has it in one, little brother, for all that he's never blooded a sword. And that, my dear young novices, tells you very nearly all you might possibly need to know about the elves, their cowardly tactics, their pernicious culture, their spiritual enervation, and their ultimate fate. More importantly, it also tells you how to kill them. It does? Marcus looked at Zephinus, but the younger Michelin clearly had no idea what Serenus was telling them either. If the two elves riding far ahead of them could hear their conversation, they weren't letting on. Aye, it most certainly does. Didn't your tutors ever force you to think, young Valerius, or did they merely set you to memorizing psalms, catechisms, and philosophers' speeches? Here, let me give you a hint. Who has the most heavy infantry? The orcs, Zephinus answered immediately. The orc tribes, Marcus echoed just a moment later. Quick on the draw, brother, Serenus said approvingly to Zephinus. There are scores of famous orc heavy foot regiments. The Black Orcs, the Red Ant Slayers, the Genghis Mountain Boys. Now why do they spend that infantry with such profligacy? Their tactics, such as they are essentially minor variations on the straightforward charge. Because they're orcs, Zephinus said. They're stupid. No, Marcus objected. Well, I mean, it's true, they're not very intelligent in comparison with man, dwarf, or elf, but mainly they're wasteful of their infantry because they can afford to be. Orklings breed and grow to maturity so quickly that no chieftain of the tribes cares much if he loses half his warriors, so long as enough survive to bring him victory that day. In fact, he probably hopes they'll kill themselves off by fighting external enemies before they get caught up in some internecine strife. That's why the tribes are always at war, either raiding human lands or fighting amongst themselves. Just too many orcs running around. And that's why they're always invading dwarven territory, Zephinus said slyly. But Lodi failed to rise to the bait and continued to ignore the conversation. Now, Serenus said, with that in mind, what can you conclude about the elven lack of infantry, Marcus Valerius? The opposite. They value their lives too dearly to dare risking them in melee combat. Precisely. That's why they fear to meet the legions at close quarters. They can't match our numbers and our discipline. That's why they will always run before the heavy horses of Savundaram, and why even the spears of the peasant levy present them with a problem. The orcs' heavy infantry haven't discipline and their armor is shoddy, but their speed, strength, and numbers make up for that and make them dangerous in close combat. As for the dwarves, well, there isn't an infantry in the world that is their equal, one for one, except the mountain trolls. So, it is fear of losing their precious long lives that dictates the elves' approach to warfare. This not only reveals a tactical weakness that can be exploited, but it is also a cultural sign that speaks volumes about the state of their race. I bet they aren't afraid of goblin infantry, Zephinus commented. No one is afraid of goblin infantry, Serenus said with a snort. Nor should anyone be, unless they happen to outnumber you 50 to 1. Fortunately, that doesn't happen very often, since the little rats take every chance they get to desert whatever orc chieftain has rounded them up to serve as frontline fodder. So, Marcus Valerius, what does this tell you about Elebrian? I'm not sure. They fear death. They will only fight from afar. They have only 3 kingdoms where there were once 7. The realization struck him suddenly. Oh, I should think their society is probably highly decadent then, that they've likely become amoral pleasure seekers like the men and women of whom Flavius Mundus wrote in the Tales of the Plague Days. Do you think they are in decline? No, it's more than that, Serenus said. I believe they are waiting to die. Fear has a specific object, not unlike hope usually, but the object of hope is a future good. A difficult one perhaps, but always something that is possible to obtain. The object of fear, on the other hand, is a future evil, an evil that irresistible only because it is desired. Even in the heat of the near midday sun, Serenus's ominous words struck Marcus with chilling effect. Waiting to die? Fear of death that was born of an irresistible desire for extinction? Although he knew that war between Amor and Elebrion was a real possibility, it had never occurred to Marcus that it might be the elves, not men, who were wishing for it. Truly. Should the Sanctif, in his wisdom, decide that they are creatures unfit to serve our immaculate Lord, Serenus said, I suggest it will be a mercy to put their cities to the torch and the remnants of their race to the sword. The High King will not lift his hand against us, not because he fears us, but because he desires what we can give him and his people in the same way that a mortally wounded soldier welcomes the last kiss of steel. Marcus rode in stunned silence, the hoof falls of the troop and the creaking of the wooden wagons the only sounds. The road had begun a slight incline and the horses were breathing harder than they had before. Fortunately, there were dark lines running parallel to the road in the distance that promised the possibility of shade once they crested the rise. Zaphinus chuckled. And here I had always thought you won that pretty face, fighting them in the borderlands, Claudius Serenus. I had no idea that they did nothing but bare their throats to your blade. If the elves are so ready to die, how did you get that scar on your face then? Were you foolish enough to let cowless Philippus shave you? Zaphinus laughed at Marcus's expression and held up a right hand with 2 fingers folded down. Philippus lost half his hand to an orc's axe at Goxlim's. Don't let him shave you. But Marcus wasn't thinking about how Serenus had been scarred. He was more curious about where he'd been when he had been scarred. Amor doesn't border on Maritime, much less Elebrion, he pointed out, and the elves haven't raided imperial territory for 100 years. So either you are much older than would seem possible, Claudius Serenus, or you are telling us tall tales, or you were fighting on behalf of someone other than the Senate and people of Amor. Serenus laughed, but before he could reply, the horses at the front of the column abruptly pulled up. Marcus rode in the saddle to see over the bishop's wagon. The lead horses had halted at a stone bridge passing over a shallow stream. In a booming voice that carried all the way back to their rear guard, Sir Hezekias announced that they would halt long enough to refresh themselves and water their horses. Normally it would be a slave's job to help Marcus from Barat's back, but although Marsupor was already cantering back toward him, Marcus didn't wait for his help to dismount. With a groan, he lifted his right leg over the saddle and dropped awkwardly to the ground. Lodi grunted and followed his example. The 2 of them locked eyes for a moment. Then the dwarf grimaced and rubbed at his thick thighs. Marcus shook his head. It was going to be a long, long ride to Elebrion. Nice one. Nice one, Box. Yes, sir. That's some good conversation. So the elves, long lives, but fear to lose them. I know that feeling. I've gone through times of despair, despairing of Christianity and waiting for death yet being terrified of it. I mean, I'm still scared of it, but we want death's destruction. We've been told, we've been promised. I wish people understood what Christianity really was. It's so much more than what the sort of evangelical... I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some great evangelicals. There's a lot of them, but there's a richness in the Catholic/Orthodox tradition that just eclipses it. I mean, others, the Lutherans, but the further Bible alone you go, the more it just loses the poetry and just becomes a sort of proof text of the scriptures without really understanding why the scriptures even came to be. Anyway, keep checking that wardrobe. You may find a lion in there. Till next time.